Name of God. In the previous session, we told you the 11th concept of generative phonology, which in this session we will continue other concepts and other important matters of generative phonology will be introduced. This reductionism originally led to the introduction of a few principles that were very much unseen before the early 60s. The most well-known one is certainly that of transformations. You know that transformation is common in syntax, and by transformations we mean rules jumping kernel sentences toward their ultimate spoken realization, subconsciously governed, yet possible to formally describe. Here you can see the function of transformation, which transformation are rules, which they are jumping kernel sentences toward their ultimate spoken realization and subconsciously governed. And traditionally, transformations led a sentence from its tip toward its surface structure. Another definition for transformation is that transformation is rules which they apply to the deep structure of the sentence and make them, by applying that rules, the output is the surface structure. From its fundamental form, carrying meaning devoid of any superfluous element, such as passive form, inversion, or inflections, toward the utterance that is actually pronounced or heard. The status of transformations has changed significantly through the years. The transformation here, we give you two definition of transformation. Transformation are rules which are applied to the deep structure and make the surface structure. And here we can see that about the concept of transformation changed through the time. Early approaches tended to add a new transformation for every new phenomenon noticed, which often made the theory very bulky. Such linguists seemed to have forgotten the basic goal of the entire school, a simple and elegant theory of the mind. In the early 70s, generative semantics introduced transformation into the domain of meaning too. It is important to here. In the early 70s, generative semantics introduced transformations into the domain of meaning. In the early 70s, generative semantics introduced transformation into the domain of meaning too. Here we can see that the transformation of Chomsky are not common just in syntax. In the early 70s, the transformation reduced for the meaning, where complications at one moment threatened to disrupt the theory from within. Chomsky thus attempted to restore some order in terms of transformation, first by systemizing them and reducing their number, which resulted in his famous Pisa lectures, where the entire set of transformational rules was reduced to a simple principle today known as transform alpha. Dear student, as I told you, the concept of transformation was changed through the time, and Chomsky tried to systemize the transformation rules and try to reduce their number, which This reducing and this systemizing resulted in the in Chomsky PISA lectures, where the entire set of transformational rules was reduced to a simple principle today known as transform alpha. Today, the minimalist model accepts a few fundamental transformations, so we can say they have remained one of the basic mechanisms of generative linguistics. Transformations need to be governed by some rules. In the previous paragraph, we introduced transformation and we defined it, and we explained the changing of transformational rules through the time and its final form. Transformations need to be governed by some rules. Early generative linguistics introduced phrase structure rules in rules related to the lexicon, which are strict categorization and lexicon insertion rules. Here we can see some rules which governed by transformation, phrase structure rules, and the strict categorization and lexicon insertion rules. More globally speaking, traditional generative linguistic rules are binary, where the instruction will or will not execute, like in computers. Okay. More globally speaking, and traditional generative linguistic rules are binary, where the instruction will or will not execute, like the computers. With these so-called Wolframness rules, there have been attempts at non-binary rules, not common in artificial intelligence, but apparently very much present in various forms of human perception, including understanding language structure. These rules originate from the early years of Gestalt psychology. They were introduced into linguistics as conversational implicators. What we mean by conversational implicators? The conversational implicators are a set of patterns allowing the speaker or hearer to conduct a relative preference among a larger number of quiet, acceptable grammatical solutions. Okay. These rules originate from the early years of Gestalt psychology. They were introduced into linguistics as a conversational implicator. Conversational implications are sets of patterns allowing the speaker or hearer to conduct a relative preference among a large number of quiet, acceptable grammatical solutions. Set of patterns allowing the speaker or hearer to conduct a relative preference among a larger number of quite acceptable grammatical solutions. That was the definition of conversational implicator. You should know that. Jack and Dove will later rename the principles as preference rules. In the dissertation of G. Ross in the 1970s, these were called constraints. The name would prevail in late government and binding theory in the minimalist program, while the concept would be brought to its extreme in optimality theory. In general, today it seems that generative grammar more and more renounces classical inflexible rules in favor of constraint. Hence, the author suggests that renunciation of strict binary choices and consequent return to Gestalt principle of perception is the elements important legacy of more recent generative theory. Okay, here we can see the elements important legacy. Okay, therefore in the previous session we read just 10 of this legacy. The elements one is that renunciation of strict binary choices and consequent binary choices, and consequent return to Gestalt principles of perception. It is another important legacy of generative theory. You should know this matter, the definition. And a very important one too, it is not so prominent in Chomsky's personal work, but is regularly found among his own supporters: government binding, minimalism, optimality theory, opponent, Lakovoyan cognitive semantic, which you can see their name here. In a work, return to Gestalt principles, renamed as constraints or preference rules, might be good venue in which the mutually conflicting approaches of cognitive linguistics in the broader sense could perhaps meet again a resolution any impartial observer would only hope for. Finally, each generative theory is heavily burdened by the problem of meaning. Each generative theory is heavily burdened by the problem of meaning. In accordance with the traditional approach to generativism, almost since the beginning of the theory, there has been a category known as features. Originally a derivation of probabilistic semantic models following the seminal work of Fodor and Katz, 1964, in early Chomsky features were viewed as the presence or absence of property in lexical and grammatical units. Thus, noun dog has the feature the noun dog. So sorry, because I saw it in the capital word. This capital word, the word which are appear in the form of capital sound, it means that it is a proposition. It is in our mind and we don't pronounce it. It just exists in our mind. Dog is plus male, which can be both a semantic and grammatical category, while the noun bachelor, again with the capital word, has the feature of minus married, which is obviously a purely semantic, even referential category. Again, the verb walk has the feature minus transitive, which must be labeled a fully grammatical category. Okay, I want to repeat this paragraph again because some of their points are important. Each generative theory is heavily burdened by the problem of meaning. In accordance with the traditional approach to generativism, almost since the beginnings of the theory, there has been the category known as features. Dear student, by features we mean this plus and minus. This plus and minus, we call these symbols plus and minus as features. I want to repeat the definition of features because it is important. When some persons told you in phonology, in all of the matter of linguistics, told you about the features, you should know that feature means this minus or plus. Minus or plus, we called these two symbols as features, which they put before some concept. In accordance with the traditional approach to generativism, almost since the beginning of the theory, there has been the category known as features. Originally, a derivation of probabilistic semantic models following the seminal work of Fodor and Katz, 1964, in early Chomsky features were viewed as the presence or absence of a property in lexical or grammatical unit. Dear student, here we have the definition of features. What we mean by features? Maybe I asked you to define the feature. You should say that. Okay, Chomsky, following the Fodor and Katz, viewed the feature in this way, that the presence or absence of a property. The presence, which we show the presence by plus, or absence, which we show the absence by minus symbol, of a property in lexical and grammatical units. Dear student, you should be able to define features, and you should write the definition of features in your summarization, and for your final exam you should know the definition of features. Again, because it is important, I want to redefine it. What we mean by features? What we mean by features? Features means the presence, here it is the definition of features, the presence or absence of a property, the presence or absence of a property in lexical and grammatical units. The presence or absence of a property in lexical or grammatical units is feature. You should know that. Here we have the example of feature. For example, the noun dog. As I told you, when we write the word by the capital form, it means that it is in our mind. It is abstract and we don't pronounce it. It exists in our mind. The dog, by its nature, has the feature of plus male. It is a feature because here we can see that we have the presence of a property in the lexical nature of that word, plus male. It is we show the feature in this way, which can be both a semantic and grammatical category. This plus, this presence is both in grammatical and semantic, while the noun bachelor has the feature of minus married, which is obviously a purely semantic. Minus married as the semantic feature, not grammatical. But here, this plus male is both grammatical and semantic. Here you can see its example. Again, the verb walk has the feature minus transitive, which must be labeled as a fully grammatical category. And here we don't have any semantic category, it is grammatical. Chomsky's early position, never fully rejected, is quite obviously untenable here. Not only does he mix grammatical and semantic categories, but more importantly, he failed to explain how come two elastic features are used in an otherwise strict formal theory, which clown would thus be plus male plus funny. The fact they come from our experience, knowledge of the world, and are thus in a kind of semantic intuition of the speaker and hearer, helps later in justifying this simple introduction of features, whose number, by the way, can then be limitless. Naturally, lexical semantics did have to be explained somehow, and the generative theory didn't seem to be capable ground for explicating the meaning of individual words. At the time, the conflict with young proponents of generative semantics emerged, ending in the complete rift mentioned above. As it may be, to the present day, Chomsky has retained the feature category. In the minimalist program, there are head, complement, and specifier features. Okay. In the minimalist program, we have head, complement, and specifier features. They are much more abstract than they used to be, but still seem to suffer from the same flaws as the standard model. Okay, here we read about the feature in different theory of Chomsky during the time. First, all of the details are not important, just those details which we define them, which we focus on them, they are important. Contrary to the meaning of individual words, which the generative theory cannot fully explain, and thus skips it in most leading models, the meaning of the sentence, logical form stemming from generative syntactic analysis, has been very well described since the 70s. Along with the well-accepted rules of set theory and formal logic conducted in formal semantics according to strict Frege principles, and the modified first-order predicate calculus, a very important role in studying the meaning of sentence structures, was played by the thematic rule theory, as developed by Fillmore in 1968 and Jackendorf in 1972. Okay. Aligned with the well-accepted rules of set theory and formal logic conducted in formal semantics, according to strict Frege principles and the modified first-order predicate calculus, a very important rule in studying meaning of sentence structure. Here, a very important role in studying the meaning of sentence structures was played by thematic rule theory, which developed by Fillmore and Jackendorf. What we mean by thematic rule theory? You should know that thematic rule theory developed by Fillmore and Jackendorf. Semantic rule theory was developed by Fillmore and Jackendorf. Why was that? A very important role in studying the meaning of sentence structure was played by semantic rule theory, which here we can see its definition. According to this theory, I mean semantic rule theory, every expression contains an argument and predicate, taken in the brutally logical rather than just grammatical sense. Dear student, you should know this line are important in this paragraph. You should know these lines. A very important role in studying the meaning of the sentence structures was played by semantic rule theory, which developed by Fillmore and Jackendorf. Based on this theory, every expression contains an argument and predicate. Every expression contains an argument and predicate, taken in the brutally logical rather than just grammatical sense. Arguments in the proposition, by definition, carry one of the semantic rules, known in the theory as theta rules, such as agent, patient, theme, recipient, owner, goal, instrument. Dear student, these lines are very, very, very important. We defined the semantic rule theory. We introduced its founder, and we told you its parts. We had semantic rule theory, which was developed by Fillmore and Jackendorf, which is more logical, is illogical sense, rather grammatical. Based on this theory, every expression contains an argument and predicate, which they are logical rather than grammatical sense. Arguments in the proposition by definition, carry the semantic rules, which we call it as a theta rules. Arguments in the proposition, by definition, carry one of the semantic rules known in the theory as theta rules. Dear student, here you can see the theta rules. Agent, patient. We have here we have the semantic rule or theta rule. Agent, patient, theme, recipient, owner, goal, instrument. Theta theory has been a very important supplementary device in the generative theory and remained one of the cornerstones of Chomskyan semantics. Theta rules were the cornerstone of Chomskyan semantics. Still, one must conclude and add as the legacy number 12 that insufficient credibility of formal sentence semantics with a simultaneous renunciation of lexical semantic and referentiality. Okay, here these lines are important. We told you about the semantic rule theory, which was developed by Fillmore and Jackendoff. Based on this theory, every expression contains an argument predicate, which they are in logical sense rather than grammatical. The argument in the proposition carry one of the semantic rules, which we call them as the theta rules. And here we introduce the theta rules for you: agent, patient, theme, recipient, owner, goal, and instrument. They are very important in generative theory, and we consider it as the Chomskyan semantic cornerstone. Evolutionism, communication, and modularity in generative theory. Generative linguistics has had a strong impact on many other research fields. First, it reintroduced rationalist epistemology, proving, and this is today undisputed, that there is a strong genetic disposition for language. At least in terms of linguistic competence, man is no longer considered a blank slate. On the other hand, generative linguistics has influenced new thought on the origins of man and purpose of the symbolic system so finely tuned in humans. Most theoreticians are today strongly on the evolutionary standpoint, where they claim language is an extension of the general cognitive capacity, which is in turn an extension of the sheer ability to psychology survive. Most also believe that the crucial language function is communicative. Most also believe that the crucial language function is communicative, where even so instrumental, interpersonal, ideational, aesthetic, and many other language functions do have some importance. Communication in fundamental sense of transferring information remains the key evolutionary step that language has bestowed on the human species. A certain legacy of the generative linguistic and the cognitive revolution is return to Darwinism. We today assume some very radical form. Okay, here you can see the 12 legacy of generative theory, which was returning to the Darwinism, and here we explain this matter. A much acclaimed such field is that evolutionary psychology, with authors such as Richard Dawkins in the 1978 and Steven Pinker in the 2002, is the most prominent advocates. Even more radical, yet much less accepted in scientific circles in the field of memetics, loosely based on an idea from Dawkins, the selfish gen, whose defender vouch for universal Darwinism ensured a possibility that not only the transmission of genes, but virtually any form of human behavior is strongly based on imitation. One must mention, however, that the Darwinism position is dominant in Chomsky's students and in the students of his students, in Lakoff, Jackendorf, Pinker, Plotkin, and others. Chomsky himself, just like the second leading authority in the philosophical psychology, Jerry Fodor, also praising Darwin, strongly opposes the idea that language is a result of natural selection. You know that Chomsky was a rationalist. There has simply not been enough time for this. Chomsky exclaimed, adding that language as we know it today existed in a pretty similar form thousands of years ago. And this doesn't Chomsky remained conspicuously alone, as he does in his thesis that communication is not really the purpose of the mental apparatus dedicated to language. Communication is a mere side effect of our highly organized society. The communication is a mere side effect of our highly organized society. The function of language is fully internal, to accommodate to the work of the mind and brain. Okay, here in this paragraph, explain about the rationalist idea of Chomsky and about the communication. Mentioning J. Fodor, also an opponent of the evolutionary perspective on language, urges one to shortly discuss the modularity thesis, which indeed gave birth to cognitive science as a separate discipline in the late 70s. Cognitive ability is not linear and equal for all mental function. On the contrary, there seems to be a general capacity, central format after the Jackendorf in the 1992, and a series of more or less specialized modules responsible for specific domains, psychologically partly independent, and thus located in relatively separate areas of the cortex. The notions in question are very abstract and the approach fully speculative, so that the status of the modular theory remains unclear today. The original idea was that of quite separate modules for the linguistic and visual capacity, perhaps also for the musical and social faculties, and maybe even the entire range of other abilities, which you can see here. This sounded ideal in the context of Chomsky. Dear student, in this paragraph, it is important you should know that Chomsky, again, in the generative theory, we come back to the Darwinism, and they were rationalists, and all of another matter are not important. And here we can see that Sky's thesis of the total specificity of language, supported by many empirical facts, such as, for instance, grammar loss in aphasia or the critical period of language acquisition. However, more recent studies suggest a different perspective. For example, Petrol et al. Were among the first to demonstrate that the musical and linguistic ability share some of the modules, in particular during temporal cognition of the syntactic information. A tendency verified in number of studies recently, similar zones of the cortex were activated, which induce a similar psychological reaction to parsers. And this in turn enabled that some aspects of musical and linguistic cognition be expressed by similar formal symbolical framework. This study, among many others, suggests that the modular theory should be either thoroughly revised or fully rejected. If the former is the case, modules are still there, but they are responsible for much more abstract faculties, often shared by our externally defined constructs such as music, language, visual perception. They seem to be organized more obscurely, though such modules for tonal perception, metaphorical representations, temporal processing, etc. Yet, if the latter is the case, all cognition is a consequence of a very complex network of inherently simple individual mental processors, which is a form of holistic view of the brain today revived in the so-called connectionism of more recent cognitive science. In generative grammar, it seems that minimalism still generally supports a modular view of the mind, while alternative approaches such as optimality theory are much more interesting to connectionism. As it may be, the advent of the new theories in neuroscience with the modular and connectionist view of the brain currently at odds seem to be our 14 major legacy of Chomsky linguistics. Dear student, in these paragraphs, just this line is important, just this, and there is a need to summarize all of these paragraphs. Just these 3 lines are important, even for your final exam too. Just the 3 lines are important, and here in this paragraph, just these 5 lines are important. Therefore, when you are summarize these matters in the previous page and in this page, just about 7 lines are important. Other matters are not important. In generative grammar, it seems that minimalism still generally supports the modular view of the mind, while alternative approaches such as optimality theory are much more interesting to connectionists. As it may be, the advent of the new theories in the neuroscience with the modular and connectionist views of the brain currently at odds seems to the 14th legacy of the Chomsky linguistics. Here we want to read the 14th legacy. The author assumed that even this short overview of the fundamental principles of generative linguistics is enough to show how influential the approach has been in the last 50 years. Its influence on the language science is huge, so important that one could confidently claim it is the dominant paradigm in modern linguistics. On the other hand, its impact on other domains of science, from music theory to brain research, is equally important. The 15th legacy of generative linguistics, and the one the author concludes this paper with, is thus the impetus to the foundation of new discipline. Subsidiary branches of the study of language, interdisciplinary field studying language and other cognitive capacity, or field fully separated from the language science, such as psycholinguistic, neurolinguistic, computational linguistic, musico-linguistic, gestalt-linguistic, and numerous others. Okay, here we read the 14th legacy of Chomsky, which it has the interdisciplinary nature, which you can see its field. Okay, that was in this session, and in the previous session we explained the article which introduced the concept of generative theory and its important matters. Dear students, you should summarize the important terms All of the matters are not important, the details are not important even for your final exam. The definition and those matter which I focus on them, they are important, and you shouldn't need to read all of the matter, they are not important. Please ask your question about this session through the WhatsApp and do its task. Thank you.